when everything you're taking in is kind of this instant gratification, mindless content, your brain is going to reflect that. Your actions are going to reflect that. So it's just like the food you eat. If you want to have a healthy body, you want to put in healthy food. If you want to have a healthy body, a healthy mind, you got to think about all of the inputs coming in, whether that's social media, the news you engage in, the relationships that you keep. All of it kind of funnels into the brain and changes the wiring.
Do you think that the world would have been better off without social media?
Yeah, what a question, right? I, there's a really interesting conversation about kind of paternalism as it relates to social media. And in America, we like to think you just let capitalism, consumerism run its course and don't worry about it. But I think it's clear that when you look at how many people are influenced by social media, how many people engage with it on a typical day, that at some point you're basically controlling reality if you're the head of one of these companies. And so that's an incredible responsibility as far as how are you changing people's brains. And, you know, I'd like to think let people do what they want and let others make decisions based on what is important to them. But we, I think, cling to this illusion of freedom of choice, meaning that once you become an adult, whatever age that might be, let's say 16, 18, 21, that all of a sudden you have complete autonomy over your choices, that you're not influenced by what's happening around you. And it's just not the case, right? Like, if that was the case, then marketing wouldn't be a thing. So we're always being influenced by our surroundings. And the concern is with social media that it is polarizing people against other people, that it is feeding people information that is unnecessarily stressful, which changes brain function in a negative way. And I think maybe most important that it takes people away from the stuff that pretty consistently over the last several thousand years is associated with better wellness, right? So if you're spending 7 hours a day on Instagram, you may not be out going for a walk. If you're spending 8 hours a day on Facebook, you're maybe not calling up your aunt and uncle to say hello. Like, they're just, it's taking the place of other things. And I won't generalize and say that social media is bad. I don't think that is the case. But I do think that there are many ways in which we can say that the time we spend on that could be better spent somewhere else.
Yeah, I think we would all have to like sit down and look at ourselves as individuals and look at how we're using it. I find myself more on Instagram and I stay away from Twitter just because I think that if I were on Twitter, I would just fall into threads that are just toxic and would ruin my entire day. So I stay away from it.
Yeah.
Instagram, I don't find it to be the case as much. It's not as easy to interact, in my opinion. Um, so
Well,
I
Instagram has changed too, you know?
yeah.
I feel like when it started, it was much more people posting about their lives, and now it's become much more brands and commercialized. So, yeah, I think, not that I'm an expert in this, but my engagement on social media, it's very different on Instagram than what it used to be when I first started on the platform, where it was really just here is an unfiltered insight into what my life is like. It went from that to a whole bunch of filters to now like a carefully curated version of a person's thoughts or a brand's thoughts.
Right. Yeah, I was thinking about what you said in terms of well, no, I was thinking more so along with me being on the fence about it and why I was on the fence. And then I was listening to you speak and I was thinking to myself about all the different conversations that I've had about why social media is good. And then I've heard conversations as to why it's bad. And I think for the people that it is beneficial for, they tend to drift towards things that are positive. And for people that, for whatever reason, are struggling in their life, they tend to drift towards things that are not as positive. And
Mhm.
it can spiral in one direction or another, which goes back again to it just depends on how you're using it. It depends on
Yeah,
how you're using it.
I think that's right. And there's some pretty interesting research on optimists and pessimists and their mental health and other things. But what's concerning about it is that it seems like it magnifies where you were at to start with. So
Exactly.
if you were
Yeah.
already feeling a little hatred towards, let's say, Republicans or Democrats or libertarians, I don't know, it makes it so easy to find yourself in a group where people are amplifying it even more. So now you've gone from being a little bit annoyed that somebody voted Democrat to being a complete anti-Democrat or anti-Republican, and starting to read into all of these kind of sensationalized claims around it. And next thing you know, you don't want to talk to your uncle because they're of the other political party. So I think it is kind of an amplifier. And my concern is that amplification tends to occur for the negative. There's great research in news, at least, showing that there's been a tendency to increase negative content because that's what keeps eyeballs on the screen. So even though there are people who are getting more net positive out of social media, the general concern is that the case for most people? And then the last thing I'll say on that is, you've probably seen this too, but there's a lot of recent research as to the psychological impact of engaging with social media. And there are those people who say social media is ruining our children's and our brains. It's making us depressed, anxious. And there are those who say, no, the research just isn't there at all. But I think that kind of in the middle, and something that stood out for me was research showing that it's a question of how we interact with social media that determines whether it influences our mental health in a positive or negative way. And this really comes down to one study where they're looking at Facebook users, and they're showing that people who engage with other people's content, commenting, liking, etc., actually had slightly better mental health versus those who passively scrolled, lurked, right? That would be the term. Just kind of lurked in the background, that they came off worse off after that engagement. So I think to your point, yeah, it is kind of a individual type thing.
All right. Well, I'll tell you what. Let's switch gears here. Let's talk more about diet, because you mentioned some of that earlier on in our discussion. What are your thoughts on the standard American diet? Very broad question. Very broad.
Well, I think unlike my response to the social media question, this one isn't quite as nuanced. I think the standard American diet, or SAD, SAD, is devastating to our health. And, you can break it down by the specifics of what is in the standard American diet. It tends to be a diet that is very high in ultra processed food. And so that's fats, proteins, carbs, all of these things have been refined in such a way that you wouldn't really find them in this state in the natural world, right? You're not going to find that Twinkie out there in the Serengeti that's wandering wild. It's been modified so much, it's hardly recognizable from the basic parts that went into it. And I think, there are tons of diet people on social, influencers, who are going to say, here's exactly the diet you need for blank. And here's why all these other diets are terrible. So whether that's the keto diet or the paleo diet or the carnivore diet, there's always going to be somebody out there saying, this is the absolute only diet that's going to work. But where I think people miss the mark is that most people are still eating terrible food. It's not like people are doing paleo and they're slipping up once in a while and that's their problem. It's that they're still going to fast food restaurants several nights of the week, right? It's still that they are purchasing things like white bread, which has very little nutritional value. And so when you think about the standard American diet, that is a diet that has been consistently associated with basically every negative health outcome there is. And that's everything from metabolic to cardiovascular to even psychological diseases. So my take on it is, yeah, the standard American diet is killing us. That's how I feel about it. As it relates to the advice that I give people, I think what's most important is to basically start eating actual foods. Most of the foods you find in the grocery store are no longer real foods from my perspective. About 70% of the food and drink that you would find in an American grocery store has added sugar. There's no need for it, right? It's just added to it because it makes it taste better. But until we start paying attention to the fact that there are additives in everything, we're going to continue damaging our brains, damaging our bodies. So again, start to pay attention to what's in your food, read the nutrition label, but also start incorporating real foods that are one ingredient. So if you're eating, meat or vegetables, can you label what that is? Is it an avocado or is it an avocado-like product? Is it a chicken or is it a breaded chicken-like product? And the more we can start distilling down to, when is this something that has been messed with by humans versus something that is relatively found in its natural state, the better it'll be for our health.
Yeah, I think it's two issues that we're actually having with people getting whole foods. It's education about what real food is, It's not all that complicated, but for some reason, people just don't understand what that means when you say real food, and then B, it's access to it. So in some of the more poor neighborhoods in the country, I did an episode on this. I don't remember what the number was on food deserts, and people don't have access to it.
Yeah,
That's a problem too. I mean, if you don't know what to look for, and B, even if you did know what to look for, you wouldn't have access to it. That is a recipe for disaster.
you're absolutely right. And let's be clear, America is subsidizing junk food. They are paying money to farmers to produce the things that are going into junk food, that are adding the extra sugar to junk food. That's just a terrible situation. And I know that at the time it probably made a lot of sense, but it's exactly what you said as far as access. And it comes back to the earlier conversation as to how we make decisions. Certainly we make choices consciously, but a lot of the time we just use whatever is nearest to us. We choose whatever is easiest. And so if you don't have access to a store that sells fruits and vegetables, and instead you have a vending machine in your office, you are going to eat out of the vending machine. And this isn't a question of willpower. It's a question of access, what is most readily available. So I think this is essential, right? This is an essential part of the conversation is how do you change the default option? How do you change the status quo so that it's easier to make the right choice and harder to make the unhealthy choice? They've started doing this by making cigarettes a little bit harder to access. Some stores will actually cover them in the drugstore so that you can't actually see the brands. Some places, I was in Indonesia last year, and they had basically these terrible things on the cigarette cartons, like pictures of people having terrible lung cancer. We've got to start doing these things so that we're less likely to choose the unhealthy option. And the myth of it all is that there's an assumption that if you put an unhealthy and a healthy option next to each other, that people will just choose the healthy option. Well, not exactly. Our brains are set up to choose the unhealthy options. We actually, if we want to put them on an even keel, we need to make it much harder to access the unhealthy version if we wanted that 50-50 chance. So I think it's key that we start addressing the access piece, but that's certainly something at the level of larger policy than just making recommendations to patients.
Well, now that we're talking about policy, I think we can sort of drift towards one of the questions that I emailed you about as it pertains to preventative medicine.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, how do you think we're, in terms of policy, in terms of our culture, the culture of medicine, how do you think we're approaching preventative medicine?
Yeah, I think in general, we're doing a terrible job at preventing much of anything as it relates to health diseases. And, the top causes of death and disability are largely preventable. Research from a large study in women suggested that about 80+% of coronary artery disease could be prevented through lifestyle modification. But ischemic heart disease remains the top killer. Like, the issue is also not that we don't know what to do, but what we need to do to prevent a whole lot of our health problems is eat healthier, exercise, and yet work on this kind of stress management techniques and provide people with the context so that they aren't constantly stressed. That will work. The problem isn't that education, it's that it's not implemented. And so, preventive medicine has this idea that is quite pervasive, and it's like this superiority thing where it's like doctors who don't practice preventive medicine don't understand like how you can prevent heart disease. They don't understand how you can prevent diabetes. And you and I both know a lot of doctors. These are not people who don't understand this stuff. Like, I could poll every single one of my doctor friends, and if I asked them, what should a person do to prevent heart disease? They would say exercise. They would say eat healthier. They would say lower stress. People know that.
Right.
So I think that where it really comes to the prevention that I'm interested in is at the level of the decision-making piece. Because I think that as long as we are predicating our recommendations on this untrue assumption that all patients need is more information on why these are the right choices, we're not getting anywhere. And, the last thing I'll say on this is there are some providers who have, for one reason or another, a wonderful, I would say, luxury, which is that they have patients come to them who haven't been able to be healed from conventional medicine doctors, and they're able to spend, the hour and a half, whatever, with the patient. They're able to get a whole bunch of labs. They're able to work with other people on their staff. And in doing so, they're able to do some great preventive medicine. But the challenge for the conventional provider is that they don't have those resources. They don't have the time, they don't have the staff, they don't have the ability to order all of these labs. And so, I think it's all well and good to promote prevention. I think that where we really need to be thinking about prevention is as it relates to making the right decisions easier, so that, I believe, gets upstream from any sort of basic lifestyle recommendation, exercise plan, whatever, and gets to the question of why is a person capable or not capable of consistently making long-term oriented decisions.
Yeah, I wonder if if that were a focus, if it would be focused in the right area or at the right age. I feel like if we're doing this at the youngest of ages, elementary school, middle school, this is just a habit that I think people could be in from when they get into their 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s.
As far as prevention?
Yeah. Teaching people how to think.
Right. There's another really fascinating kind of correlate to what you're saying, which is there's this belief where it's like children don't have the executive functions to be able to make certain decisions. You don't let a 10-year-old get behind the wheel of a car and drive through traffic. You don't let a 9-year-old decide if he wants to smoke or not. And why do we do that? It's because we believe that the brain is not developed enough for that person, that child, to make the decisions that we would call the right decisions. We don't let people gamble when they're 8 years old. Why is that? Because we wouldn't trust them to make good judgment decisions with the money. So that assumes that the brain is in process, and that's supported by studies of brain anatomy, where we know that parts of the brain, like the prefrontal cortex, continue to kind of develop into early adulthood and into the 20s. The challenge, though, is that we believe that somehow adults are immune to this, that our brains, all of a sudden, once you hit whatever age, 21, 18, have completely solidified and now are capable of consistently making good choices. And then the other challenge is that if you believe children are susceptible to making poor choices, what are the messages that we are giving them? So if you look at the ads on TV for children's stations, they're for junk food. They're for sugar-filled cereals. I mean, I know I remember those,
Oh, yeah,
Apple Jacks and Frosted Flakes. If you look at the celebrity endorsement for children's products, they're hugely for these unhealthy foods, beverages. And so why that is a problem is because our preferences, in many cases, are embedded into our brains early in life. Our habits, just like you said, are embedded in our brains early in life. So you get a kid to make the association between waking up on Saturday morning and their bowl of pick your own, sugary cereal. You create the association, right? You embed that in the brain. And studies have shown that even decades later, people preserve that association. So the point I'm trying to make here is that our habits, our cognition is changed at a very early age by our exposures. And so that can be for the better by teaching people healthy habits, making those associations, or it can be for the worse, which is what we're doing right now, where it's like, oh, well, it's another holiday. So what happens on holidays? Well, this holiday, we send you out around the neighborhood and you get to come home and eat 3 pounds of candy. Like all of our holidays, I don't know if you've thought about this, but all of our holidays create this powerful association between eating absolute junk and the happiness that comes with the holiday, the special feelings that come with the holiday. You have to have your Christmas cookies, Thanksgiving, it's pumpkin pie, Valentine's, it's these terrible little heart-shaped candies, St. Patrick's Day, it's the green beer. There's always something.
We'll have to talk off camera my opinion on holidays. Actually, I won't I won't speak about my opinion on holidays on camera. No, I agree, man. These changes are very important, and the changes are rapid. Also, I mean, between the ages of birth till the age of 5, the amount of changes that are occurring are enormous. Enormous. And then you go from ages 5 to 12, 12 to 14, 14 to 18. I really do think that's the time. If we're going to teach people how to make decisions, that might be the best time to do it, man. Start the good habits and good decision making early on.
I think so. And I think including mindfulness in that as well. it's kind of one of these topics that at one point in my life I would have characterized as woo, the idea of woo.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
the more time I spend with it, the more I realize how valuable it is, because mindfulness is the opportunity to delay and think things through before you act. And it's also, one of the greatest strategies to kind of engage our emotional cognition with our more rational cognition from my perspective. And so I think that as it relates to educational initiatives, that one makes a lot of sense to me. I know they've tried it in some schools with some success, but trying to help people making better decisions when they're younger, creating in kids this ability to pause, to engage some mindfulness, and then decide what they're going to do seems like a really practical strategy.
yeah. All right, so we're going to switch gears again. So I want you to a lot of what we discussed today. I think you've done a fantastic job expanding on all of these thoughts. Some of your thoughts and some of your ideas are in the form of a book. So you co-authored a book titled Brainwash. I'd like you to tell me a little bit about that. What was your book about, and what was your inspiration for writing the book?
Yeah, thank you. Brainwash is a book that I wrote with my dad, who is a neurologist, and it really came out of the conversation that we started this podcast with, which is, why is it that despite having all the information, we're not making the right choices? And again, right, subjective, of course, but why are we not making the choices that contribute to the things we care about, to our physical and mental health? And what we did in Brainwash is built out kind of a platform for people to understand how in the modern day our brains are being changed in such a way that promotes more impulsive and less health promoting decisions. And then on the other hand, we outlined the strategies that have been shown in the research to help contribute to making better choices, especially when I say better, I mean the choices that correlate with long term health and happiness. So it's kind of a big topic. We really focused on certain brain pathways, specifically the pathway between a part of the limbic or emotional part of the brain called the amygdala, and a part of the higher level thinking apparatus, which is called the prefrontal cortex in the brain, and how, in order to make more long-term oriented health related decisions, we need to be prioritizing the activation of this prefrontal cortex and the connection to the limbic system, the amygdala, because when those things don't happen, when they break down, you see much higher rates of basically worse decision making, worse mental health, and worse physical health. So we're really just talking about, like, what are the lifestyle factors that are involved in changing your brain to either assist you or kind of damage your ability to make good choices.
So I have two more questions for you. Could you talk to me a little bit about the frameworks around the mechanism of depression and the gut brain interactions? That's question one. What are the
Well,
frameworks?
I know that you're far more in this than I am as it relates to the clinical work in mental health. My work has been primarily in, again, trying to understand the frameworks that underlie brain issues like poor decision making, and then how that relates to things like bad mental health. And so one of the areas within that I've really become interested in the last couple of years is what's happening in depression. Because what's fascinating is I had this understanding through much of my medical training that depression was a serotonin deficiency. If you didn't have enough serotonin, you were depressed. And if you had enough serotonin, I guess you were a happy person for the rest of your life. And so we had these drugs like SSRIs that would increase the serotonin in your brain. And that's what I would prescribe for my primary care patients. That's what I learned about in med school was the right decision. And, obviously psychotherapy comes in there too, but as it relates to what's happening in the brain, it's the serotonin. And the more I started reviewing the literature on this, the more that I realized, first of all, antidepressants that only engage the serotonin system are not necessarily efficacious all of the time. And beyond that, the mechanisms by which they work when they are efficacious may not have as much to do with serotonin. So then I said, what else is happening here? And we get back to this question of neuroplasticity and an associated term called neurogenesis, which is the ability to create new neurons. And so researchers have shown that in depression, there may be a deficit or a defect in neurogenesis, neuroplasticity in a part of the brain called the hippocampus, the memory center of the brain. And researchers have also shown that consistently there are elevated levels of inflammation in the body in people who are depressed. And there's also research showing that the HPA axis, or basically the stress response system, might be a little bit dysregulated in cases of depression. So, not to say that any one of those answers is going to be the solution to every case of depression. But when you look at those as kind of a suite or a bunch of different things that are involved, and you say, how do those relate to our lifestyle decisions? These are all things that we are changing based on what's going on in our gut, based on what's going on with our diet, our exercise. And so what's really interesting about it is these are also the same systems that are involved with decision making. And so it's moving away for me from the idea I had where it's depression is a problem with the mind. Maybe there's the serotonin piece. High blood pressure is an issue with the blood vessels. Diabetes is an issue with blood sugar and the pancreas, and saying all of these things are interconnected. And so basically the idea I described earlier on, it's instead of looking at conditions like depression from this blame or mind-focused mentality, it's to say, what else is going on beneath the surface here, and how else can we potentially help this by looking at more variables? So that's been my work. I have some work that I'm hoping to get published on that soon, but I think that my advocacy around this is certainly not to try to step in on people like you who are doing the clinical work, but instead to say, what might we be missing as it relates to these mechanisms, and then how do those mechanisms kind of overlap with what I've already described as it relates to the brain changes that occur with poor decision making and poor cognition.
Yeah, when I didn't hear about the 30-30-30 rule until I did residency. And for people who don't know, that is saying that SSRIs are 30% effective, doing what they need to do, increasing the serotonin, and then 30% maybe placebo, and then another 30% are just ineffective.
There's the placebo piece of it seems like it's a big deal, right? It's not so much about the mechanism of action. I mean, the other thing that's really interesting to think about is when you look at what an SSRI does in the brain, so not in human brains necessarily, but when you look at animal models, it increases serotonin in the synapse pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. And the effects of an SSRI, or I guess, let me just ask you, when you prescribe them, when do you start looking to see whether it's working or not?
Sometimes people get an effect after about a week, but you really don't get effects until 4 to 6 weeks.
Right, 4 to 6 weeks before you say, was this a failure or did it work? Which doesn't really fit with that, because if you're going to increase serotonin and that's the problem, you should be happy right away. And I know happy is a huge generalization. That's not exactly the right term. But
I know what you mean. Yeah.
the point being is, if you're increasing serotonin and a person is now helped, you would expect that to happen right away. And so some of the really interesting stuff around what other mechanisms might be involved actually comes from research in ketamine, because unlike SSRIs, ketamine-assisted therapy for depression can have effects within hours. And so one of the kind of mechanisms that they're looking at for ketamine compared to SSRIs is that it augments or increases neuroplasticity because it acts at the receptors at the edges of the neurons. So it means, ketamine isn't an SSRI. It doesn't necessarily work through the serotonin system like does something like, fluoxetine. Therefore, maybe there's something more at play. So neuroplasticity can be fostered potentially by ketamine and other similar molecules. Then I ask myself, are there lifestyle techniques that may be coming online in the next few years that can hit those same systems, not in as quick and as potent of a way, but that we can be doing in the background to potentially prevent people from getting to the point where they need to get ketamine therapy?
Yeah. No, there's definitely more at play. And again, when I first heard the 30-30-30 rule, that's kind of when I really started to care even more about how beneficial therapy can be for people. It's not just, when you do therapy, it's not just CBT. It's also helping the patient look at what you've been talking about for the past hour, their environment, what they're eating. That's a part of it too. Yeah.
100%. Yeah. this was one of the things that always bothered me when I had my primary care clinic in the VA is somebody would come in with some event that happened in their life. Their spouse died or they just lost their job, and they would test positive on the depression questionnaire. And maybe they would test positive on it for long enough that I could say, you have a diagnosis of major depression. And to imagine that the problem is a serotonin issue, right? But no, the problem isn't serotonin. The problem is that this person lost their job, and the psychological toll of it has led to the symptoms of depression. And sure, the molecular basis of it may involve serotonin, may involve other systems in the brain, but it seems like kind of such a cop-out to not think about those other variables. And one of the reasons that psychotherapy always made so much sense to me is, what goes in through your eyes and ears and nose, these things influence your neurochemistry just the same ways in which these exogenous molecules that we take as drugs can do so. And it's one of the reasons I tell people as it relates to the news, like, you think about what's going in through your mouth, whether you're eating junk food or healthy food, and you can see, like, if you eat one thing, it changes your body because it's a food that gets absorbed and assimilated into your tissues. But people don't think about how what comes in through their senses can have the same kind of changes through, like, the stress system, and just talking to somebody can influence their neurochemistry through some of the same pathways that something like a drug can. So it, I don't know, it's a weird thing where talk is seen as somehow inferior, but probably for the majority of humanity's existence, that has been the primary thing that has changed psychological state, and not drugs.
Yeah. Well, unlike my feelings about preventative medicine, I will say that I think psychiatry, just mental health in general, is moving more in the direction of it being much more than just a serotonin imbalance. I think we're moving more in that direction, that there are other factors to consider. So I'm very happy about that. Last question for you. What are your plans for the future? What do you got going on? What do you got cooking?
This is it. After this podcast, I don't know. The time horizon is collapsed. So I'm working on a bunch of different projects at any given time. I don't know ever which ones I should be being vocal about, because I never know exactly which ones are going to come to fruition. But so I primarily do consulting, some work with coaching groups, and I'm working on another, like, more substantial book type project / a course. But I'm trying to get more into the academic world with hopefully a publication. And, the big picture is, when I talk about get the stuck out, or really anything I'm doing in that space, it's that I'm trying to ferret out and help improve my stuckness just as much as I'm trying to help other people's. And really everything that I do stems from that, whether it's my work stuff, relationship stuff. It's almost trying to decondition myself from the idea of what a successful life looks like, and trying to find the things that both in my life and ideally in other people's life have a stronger correlation with wellness. So it's a lot of investigation. It's a lot of reading studies and trying to synthesize from that what were my conditioned beliefs as to what actually works and what maybe I was missing. So my overall goal is just to try to synthesize what's available through multiple fields of research into things that are useful for me and useful for other people. And, I mentioned my interest here in depression and anxiety. I think there's still so much to be done on that front, as far as better understanding how things like our hormones, our immune cells, and neurotransmitters beyond just, obviously we mentioned serotonin, but beyond norepinephrine and dopamine and some of these other targets of conventional drugs might work. I think there's a lot to be said for where we may see research in ketamine and other psychedelics in the future. And, I'm just trying to take in as much as I can so that I can be useful to others.
Oh, I like the sound of that. So yeah, if anyone listening wants to follow Dr. Perlmutter on his journey, what's your Instagram handle?
It's at Austinperlmutter.
Okay. Your Clubhouse handle?
At Dr. Austin.
What's your Twitter?
Honestly, if you've gotten this far, just doing the other ones.
Some people don't have all three. That's why
it's at Austin Pearl MD.
Don't be difficult at the end of the interview. Perlmutter. All right. You can also get Brainwash. You can find that on Amazon, like I said, at other book retailers. Also, you have I think you have a blog on Psychology Today that I took a look at. It's what's that called? The Modern Brain.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah. You can take a look at that also. And I think that's everything for you there. Did I miss anything else out of all of your?
The one thing is, if you're interested in hearing me talk, which I am not sure that is of interest to you, but let's say you are that person. You can also check out my podcast.
That's right.
I mentioned earlier. It's called Get the Stuck Out. It's on Apple and Spotify.
How often do you premiere episodes?
Once every couple of weeks right now. I'm at episode 9 and I'm working on episode 10.
All right. Well, I knew I forgot something. That was the big one. I would have seen it eventually. Thank you. Making me a better podcast host. All right, Dr. Perlmutter. It was a pleasure talking to you. I think that was a good talk, man. I think you did a fantastic job. I appreciate you stopping by. That's all.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thank you.